June 5th, 1944. 11:47 p.m. Sainte-Mère-Église, Normandy, France. Hauptmann Friedrich Weber lowered his field glasses and laughed, a deep, mocking sound that echoed across the cobblestone square. Above him, the night sky erupted with white blossoms. Parachutes, dozens of them, drifting like dandelion seeds over the Norman countryside. His men gathered around, grinning, rifles slung casually over shoulders. Americans, Weber spat the word with contempt, jumping into darkness like children playing war games. By morning, we'll have them all in cages. But what Weber witnessed in that moment was only the beginning. Within hours, 13,000 American paratroopers would tear through German rear positions like a storm through paper, turning mockery into terror and confidence into chaos. Just 18 hours earlier, no German commander in Normandy believed the Allies would dare such madness. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. June 5th, 1944, 5 a.m., Cherbourg Peninsula, France. General-Major Wilhelm Fally stood in his command post overlooking the windswept beaches of the Cotentin Peninsula. Maps covered every surface. Defensive positions, minefields, artillery emplacements. Everything was prepared. Everything was perfect. The Atlantic Wall, Hitler's fortress Europe, stretched along the coast like an iron curtain. Concrete bunkers, barbed wire, millions of mines. Rommel himself had inspected these defenses and declared them formidable. Fally commanded the 91st Air Landing Division, a unit specifically trained to counter airborne operations. His 12,000 men were positioned precisely where intelligence suggested paratroopers might land. Anti-aircraft batteries dotted the countryside. Machine gun nests covered every field and hedgerow. If the Americans were foolish enough to jump, they would be slaughtered before they touched the ground. Fally poured himself coffee and studied the weather reports. A storm was brewing over the English Channel. Winds gusting to 25 knots, cloud cover at 500 feet, waves 8 feet high. He smiled. No invasion force could cross in such conditions. The Allies would need calm seas, clear skies, and a full moon for their airborne assault. None of those conditions existed tonight. "Sir," his aide entered, carrying decoded intelligence. "Latest reports from Paris. Enemy radio traffic is minimal. No unusual movement detected across the channel." Fally nodded. "The Americans are not coming tonight. Perhaps not this week. Tell the men they can rest easy." Across Normandy, German commanders shared this confidence. They had spent years preparing for this moment. They knew the Allied playbook, Montgomery's preference for overwhelming preparation, Eisenhower's caution, the Americans' reliance on air superiority. An invasion required perfect conditions. Tonight offered none. In Sainte-Mère-Église, Hauptmann Weber conducted his evening inspection with the boredom of routine. The small town sat astride the main road connecting Cherbourg to the beaches. Whoever controlled this crossroads controlled the peninsula. Weber's company held the town with 150 men, more than enough for a backwater garrison duty. "Herr Hauptmann," his sergeant approached, "should we maintain full alert tonight?" Weber waved dismissively. "Half strength is sufficient. The storm will keep the skies empty. Let the men sleep." The sergeant hesitated. "Sir, the American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions are training in England. Intelligence suggests many things. The Americans talk constantly about their paratroopers, elite soldiers, screaming eagles. All American?" He laughed. "Propaganda for the newspapers back home. When they jump, if they jump, it'll be in daylight with fighter cover into open fields we've already targeted. Not at night, not in a storm. The Americans are not suicidal." But what Weber and Fally didn't know was that across the Channel, in dozens of airfields throughout southern England, 13,000 American paratroopers were already climbing into their aircraft. June 5th, 1944, 7:30 p.m., Greenham Common Airfield, England. Lieutenant James Hartwell checked his gear for the 10th time. Parachute, reserve chute, rifle, grenades, ammunition, knife, first aid kit, maps sealed in waterproof pouches. Over 120 pounds of equipment hung on his 160-pound frame. Around him, hundreds of paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne Division did the same, faces tight with focus. 2 years of training, tower jumps, mock villages, night drops had led to this moment. Yet no amount of preparation could steel them for what awaited across the channel. "Listen up," Colonel Roy Lindquist shouted. "Weather's turned bad. High winds, low clouds. Command's debating whether to scrub the operation." A murmur rippled through the ranks. They had been on edge for days, adrenaline simmering. Standing down now would be unbearable. "But," Lindquist continued, "Eisenhower just gave the order. We jump tonight, all of us, 82nd and 101st together, 13,000 men behind Utah Beach before the naval invasion." Hartwell felt his stomach knot. The plan was bold to the point of madness. Drop 2 full airborne divisions into occupied France in total darkness, seize bridges and roads, disrupt German reinforcements, and hold until dawn. On paper, it was brilliant. In reality, it was chaos waiting to happen. Lindquist spread a map on a crate. "Our objectives: Sainte-Mère-Église, Chef du Pont, La Fière. Hold these and we control the peninsula. If we fail, the men on Utah Beach die, and maybe the whole invasion with them." At division headquarters, Major General Matthew Ridgway addressed his officers. "The Germans think we won't jump in this weather," he said. "They believe we're cautious. Tonight, we prove them wrong." Ridgway, a hard, fearless leader, had jumped with his men in Sicily. His calm steadied the room. "The 101st drops south to secure the causeways. Without those exits, our boys will be trapped on the beach. The 82nd goes west of the Murderay River. Take the towns, destroy the bridges, hold until link-up." A colonel asked quietly, "Sir, expected casualties?" Ridgway didn't blink. 70% in the first 24 hours. Silence. 7 out of 10 men gone within a day. "But," he said, voice like steel, "the survivors will change the course of history. Get to your planes." At every airfield across southern England, the same scene unfolded. The screaming eagles of the 101st Airborne checked weapons, tightened harnesses, and wrote final letters home. Private Thomas Keller sat in a C-47, engines rumbling beneath his boots. "You scared?" a buddy yelled. "Terrified." "Good. Means you're sane." At 10:15 p.m., the first planes lifted off into the stormy dark. One by one, 822 C-47s took flight, carrying 13,000 paratroopers, the largest airborne armada in history. Inside, men sat shoulder to shoulder, surrounded by the smell of oil, sweat, and fear. Some prayed, some sang, a few closed their eyes. Through the small window, Hartwell watched the last lights of England fade. Ahead lay black water, occupied France, and destiny. The Germans believed no one would attack in such weather. They were about to be proven wrong. June 6, 1944, 12:30 a.m., over the English Channel. The C-47s flew at 1,500 feet, below the cloud deck, buffeted by winds that tossed the aircraft like toys. Inside, paratroopers gripped their static lines and fought against air sickness. The turbulence was brutal. Sudden drops that lifted men off their seats, sideways lurches that slammed them against the fuselage. 5 minutes, the jumpmaster shouted, holding up 5 fingers. Hartwell struggled to his feet, hooking his static line to the overhead cable. Around him, 18 men did the same, forming 2 lines facing the door. His heart hammered, his mouth was dry. Every instinct screamed at him to stay in the plane, to not jump into darkness over enemy territory in the middle of a storm. But training overrode instinct. He shuffled forward, one hand on the static line, the other clutching his reserve chute. Through the open door, he could see nothing. No lights, no landmarks, just blackness and the roar of wind. "Stand by." The jump master positioned himself at the door, one hand on the frame, watching for the signal light. Red light, yellow light, green light. Go, go, go! Hartwell didn't think. He jumped. The wind caught him immediately, spinning him violently. The static line yanked his main chute open with a bone-jarring jolt. Suddenly, the roar of engines faded, replaced by the whistle of wind through parachute shrouds. He looked down. Still nothing but darkness. No idea where he was, no idea where the ground was. He pulled on his risers, trying to control his descent, but the wind was too strong. Around him, white parachutes blossomed in the night. Dozens of them, hundreds, scattered across miles of sky. The formation had broken apart completely. Men were spread across the countryside like seeds thrown by a careless farmer. Then the ground appeared. Suddenly, violently. Hartwell hit hard, rolling through wet grass, his parachute dragging him across a field. He punched the quick release, scrambled to his feet, and immediately dropped into a crouch, rifle ready. Silence. Just wind and the distant sound of aircraft engines. He had no idea where he was. The drop zone was supposed to be near Sainte-Mère-Église, but in the storm, the pilots had scattered the paratroopers across 20 miles of Norman countryside. Some men landed in their designated zones, most didn't. Hartwell pulled out his cricket, a small metal clicker that made a distinctive sound. Click, click. The recognition signal. From somewhere in the darkness, click, 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 click. He moved toward the sound low and fast, until a shape emerged from the shadows. "2nd Battalion?" Hartwell whispered. "3rd," the other paratrooper replied. "You got any idea where we are?" Not a clue. More men appeared, drawn by the cricket clicks. Within minutes, Hartwell had gathered 8 paratroopers, none from his unit, all scattered and lost. They huddled in a hedgerow, checking maps by shielded flashlight. "Best guess, we're about 5 miles east of our drop zone, which means the Germans are between us and our objective." This was the situation across Normandy. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions had been scattered to the winds. Instead of concentrated drops near objectives, the paratroopers were spread across the entire Cotentin Peninsula. Small groups of men, alone in enemy territory, trying to find their units and complete their missions. But this chaos, this scattering that seemed like disaster, would become something else entirely.
June 6, 1944, 12:45 a.m., Sainte-Mère-Église, France. Hauptmann Weber was jolted awake by aircraft engines, not distant but overhead. He stumbled to the window of his commandeered house and stared up. The sky thrummed with planes. "Alarm! Alarm!" he barked, seizing his pistol and boots. Outside, his men were already moving. Anti-aircraft guns spat tracer into the night. The roar of aircraft, machine guns, and rifles braided into a cacophony. Then came the parachutes. Dozens unfurled against the sky, descending like ghosts into the square. "Americans!" someone screamed. Weber's training took over. "2nd platoon, to the square. 1st platoon, cover the roads. Machine guns, the church," he ordered. Men landed badly. Some tangled in elms. One canopy snagged the church steeple, leaving a soldier swinging helplessly above the cobbles. German rifles cut him down as he flailed. Others hit the square and struggled free of harnesses under a hail of bullets. Bodies crumpled, cries for medics mixed with shouted orders and curses. Sainte-Mère-Église became a killing ground. German detachments hunted paratroopers through narrow lanes and gardens. Americans returned fire from doorways and shuttered windows. Fires licked at timbered facades. The town convulsed in sudden, brutal contact, close, chaotic, merciless. Reports arrived like scattered echoes. Paratroopers at Chef Dupont. Americans near Lafayette Bridge. Drops reported by Amfreville. Weber's confidence frayed. This was no isolated raid. It was an invasion stitched across the night sky, enemy soldiers pouring into villages and crossroads across the peninsula. He barked at his radio operator. "Patch me to division headquarters, now!" At General Major Falley's command post, officers clustered over maps, faces pale. Placards and pins could not make sense of the flood. Confirmed drops in a dozen sectors, enemy strength unknown. Hundreds, perhaps thousands. "This is madness," an adjutant muttered. "No one would commit whole divisions in this weather." "They have," another replied. Falley dialed frantic numbers, demanded reinforcements, and spat orders to reopen roads and restore communications. Replies were fractured, lines dead or jammed. "Find them, annihilate them before dawn," he snarled, though his voice betrayed doubt. Even as orders flew, the pattern of the night made itself clear. The Americans were everywhere and nowhere, fractured into small, lethal clusters that outran coordination. The confusion that should have doomed them would instead become the weapon that shattered German response. By dawn, the Wehrmacht would face a nightmare sewn from the patchwork of 1,000 scattered landings.
June 6, 1944, 2 a.m., Norman countryside. Lieutenant James Hartwell crouched in the damp grass, his breath fogging in the cold night air. Around him, 8 paratroopers, men from scattered units of the 82nd and 101st, moved cautiously through the hedgerows toward distant gunfire. None of them knew exactly where they were. Maps were useless in the maze of fields and sunken lanes, but their objective was clear: find the fight, complete the mission, and link up with whoever they could. "Contact, front," someone whispered. Hartwell froze. 10 German soldiers were walking along a dirt road, rifles slung carelessly, chatting as if the night were theirs. They had no idea a squad of armed Americans crouched 20 yards away in the darkness. Hartwell's hand went up, silent signals flashing through the line. Grenades first, then rifles. The attack came like lightning. Explosions tore through the stillness, followed by staccato gunfire. The Germans never stood a chance. When the last echoes faded, bodies littered the road. "Take their ammunition," Hartwell ordered. "Move fast. There'll be more coming." That brutal efficiency repeated itself across Normandy. Scattered paratroopers, often miles from their drop zones, formed small, improvised squads. They ambushed patrols, cut phone lines, blew up bridges, and blocked roads. Each tiny skirmish multiplied confusion tenfold. To the Germans, it felt like an army had materialized in the dark. Reports came in from every direction: paratroopers in the forests, in the villages, near bridges, in farmhouses. They seemed to be everywhere. Commanders couldn't move reinforcements or communicate between units. What looked like an American blunder, thousands of men scattered by wind and chaos, was becoming their greatest advantage. At Sainte-Mère-Église, the tide was turning. Despite the massacre in the town square, survivors regrouped at the outskirts. Officers gathered men from any company they found, organizing counterattacks and seizing weapons from fallen comrades. Lieutenant Colonel Edward Krauss, commander of 3rd Battalion, 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, had landed miles from his intended drop zone. But by sheer determination, he collected nearly 200 men along the way, a ragtag force united by purpose. "We take that town," Krauss told them, pointing east. "It's the key to the whole peninsula. Without it, the Beach Boys can't break out." At 4:30 a.m., under the faintest hint of dawn, they attacked. Teams advanced through the streets, clearing buildings with grenades and close-quarter gunfire. Bazookas silenced machine guns. Each block was taken yard by yard, every corner contested. Hauptmann Weber's garrison fought back fiercely,
But they were overwhelmed. Surrounded, disoriented, outnumbered, they could no longer hold a line. "Fall back!" Weber shouted. "To the north edge of town!" But retreat became rout. American fire cut down men as they ran. By 5 a.m., Sainte-Mère-Église was in American hands, the first French town liberated on D-Day. Krauss personally raised the Stars and Stripes over the church square, the same steeple where an American paratrooper had hung dead hours earlier. Weber and a few survivors fled into the fields, stunned and broken. In less than 4 hours, confident occupiers had become hunted men. Across the Cotentin Peninsula, the same story unfolded. At La Fière Bridge, men of the 82nd fought desperately to hold a crossing over the Méridet River. At Chef du Pont, small American groups fended off armored counterattacks with rifles and grenades. Bazookas silenced machine guns. Behind Utah Beach, the 101st Airborne seized the causeways that would let seaborne troops push inland. But the price was steep. Many paratroopers lay tangled in trees or drowned in flooded marshes under the weight of their own gear. Others died alone in the hedgerows, firing until their last bullet. Their names would never appear on maps, but their actions shaped the battlefield that dawn. As the first light crept across Normandy, Generalmajor Wilhelm Folly finally understood the scope of the disaster. Reports screamed of enemy troops everywhere, roads cut, bridges held, communications dead. Then came the final message: ships on the horizon. Thousands of them. The Allied invasion had begun. Folly climbed into his staff car, barking orders to regroup near the coast. He never made it. Outside Picoville, hidden paratroopers opened fire from the hedgerows. The general died instantly, killed by the very men he had dismissed as disorganized amateurs. His death marked more than the fall of one officer. It symbolized the collapse of German certainty itself. On that stormy night, 13,000 American paratroopers had turned chaos into strategy, fear into momentum, and confusion into victory. But D-Day was only beginning, and their hardest fight was yet to come.
June 6, 1944, 6:30 a.m., Utah Beach, Normandy coast. The naval bombardment had turned the beach into hell on earth. Shells screamed overhead, detonating against German bunkers with earth-shaking force. Through the smoke and chaos, the first landing craft pushed toward shore, carrying men who had no idea if the paratroopers had succeeded in their mission. Aboard USS Bayfield, Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt, Jr., son of the former president and assistant division commander of the 4th Infantry Division, watched the beach through binoculars. He was 56 years old, walking with a cane due to arthritis and a bad heart. Doctors had told him he was unfit for combat. He had insisted on leading the first wave anyway. "Sir," his aide said quietly, "the landing craft are approaching the beach. First wave in 3 minutes." Roosevelt nodded, his jaw set. Everything depended on what happened in the next few hours. If the paratroopers had failed to secure the causeways leading off the beach, his men would be trapped in a killing zone with no escape. If the Germans could rush reinforcements to the coast, the invasion would drown in blood before it began. But if those scattered paratroopers, those 13,000 men who had jumped into darkness and chaos, if they had done their job, then maybe, just maybe, the invasion had a chance. The landing craft hit the sand. Ramps dropped. Men poured out into waist-deep water, struggling toward the beach under the weight of equipment and the terror of enemy fire. Roosevelt waded ashore with the first wave, cane in one hand, pistol in the other. He looked around quickly, oriented himself, and realized immediately that they had landed in the wrong place, nearly 2,000 yards south of their intended beach. An officer ran up to him. "Sir, we're off target. Should we try to shift north?" Roosevelt looked at the beach, then inland. He made a decision that would become legendary. "We'll start the war from right here." He was right to trust his instincts. The wrong beach was actually less heavily defended, and more importantly, the causeways leading inland were secure. The paratroopers had done their job. 15 miles inland, Hauptmann Weber crouched in a barn with the 30 survivors of his company. They had retreated from Sainte-Mère-Église in the pre-dawn darkness, harassed every step by American paratroopers who seemed to materialize from nowhere. His radio man finally got through to another German unit. "Sir, it's chaos. Multiple reports of American soldiers across the entire sector. No one knows how many. Headquarters is demanding we counterattack and retake the town, but what?" Weber demanded. "Sir, the naval invasion has begun. Thousands of ships off the coast. They're landing at Utah Beach right now." Weber felt his stomach drop. The paratroopers hadn't been a raid. They had been the opening move of the largest invasion in history. While German forces had been scattered, chasing phantoms through the hedgerows, the Allies had landed an army on the beaches. He grabbed the radio microphone. "This is Weber, 709th Division. We need immediate reinforcement to block the roads from Utah Beach. The Americans will try to link up with their airborne forces. If we don't stop them—" Static. Then a different voice. "All units are engaged. No reinforcements available. You are ordered to hold your position and prevent enemy movement toward the coast." Weber looked at his 30 exhausted men. Hold against how many? Hundreds? Thousands? With what? The answer came 20 minutes later, when the sound of engines echoed across the fields. Weber positioned his men in the hedgerows along the road, preparing for what he knew would be a futile stand. The first American vehicles appeared, jeeps mounted with machine guns, followed by infantry moving in tactical formation. These weren't the scattered paratroopers from the night before. This was an organized force, well-equipped and advancing with purpose. "Hold fire until they're in the kill zone," Weber whispered. His men tensed, fingers on triggers, watching the Americans approach. 50 yards, 40, 30, fire! The hedgerow erupted in gunfire. The lead jeep's windshield shattered. American soldiers dove for cover, returning fire immediately. For a few minutes, the Germans held their position, but then the Americans deployed mortars, flanking teams, and concentrated fire that overwhelmed the thin defensive line. "Fall back!" Weber shouted. "Fall back!" But there was no next position, just more hedgerows, more roads, more American soldiers pushing inland. By noon, they had been pushed 5 miles from the beach. Weber finally accepted the truth. They weren't stopping anything. The Americans were everywhere, and the German army in Normandy was collapsing into chaos.
Back at Sainte-Mère-Église, Lieutenant Colonel Krauss watched as the first elements of the 4th Infantry Division rolled into town at 1:45 p.m. Tanks, trucks, artillery, a proper army, linking up with the paratroopers who had held the town through the morning. A young captain jumped from a jeep and saluted. "Sir, Captain Richards, 8th Infantry Regiment, are we glad to see you?" Krauss smiled grimly. "The feeling's mutual, Captain. We've been having quite a morning." "We heard. Word is you boys dropped in the middle of the night and raised hell with the Germans. That true?" "That's putting it mildly," Krauss replied. "We've got wounded who need evacuation, and we're low on ammunition. But the town is secure, and we've been holding the roads." Richards looked around at the paratroopers, dirty, exhausted, many wounded, but still on their feet. "You held this place with how many men?" "Started with about 200. We're down to maybe 150 now." The captain shook his head in admiration. "You held a key crossroads with 150 men against an entire German division sector?" "We didn't have much choice," Krauss said. "Besides, we weren't alone. There are small groups of our boys scattered all over this peninsula, causing trouble. The Germans have no idea where we are or what we're doing. That's half the battle right there." It was true. Across the Cotentin Peninsula, small groups of American paratroopers were still fighting isolated battles. Some groups numbered 50 men, others had only 5 or 6. But each group was a thorn in the German side, blocking roads, cutting communications, and creating a perception that American forces were far larger and more organized than they actually were. Lieutenant Hartwell's makeshift squad had grown to 23 men by mid-morning.
They had ambushed 2 German patrols, destroyed a communications hub, and were now dug in at a crossroads 5 miles behind German lines. "Lieutenant," his sergeant asked, "what's the plan? Do we try to link up with our units?" Hartwell studied his map. "Our orders were to disrupt German reinforcements moving toward the beaches. We're doing that right here. Every German soldier looking for us is a soldier not fighting at Utah Beach. So we just keep fighting until we run out of ammunition or the invasion force reaches us, whichever comes first." Well, when you put it that way, it sounds almost reasonable. They stayed at that crossroads for another 6 hours, fighting off 3 German attempts to push through. Each time, Hartwell's men used the hedgerows to their advantage, ambushing from concealment, falling back to new positions, making the Germans pay for every yard. When American tanks finally reached their position at dusk, Hartwell had 14 men left. 9 had been wounded, 3 seriously, but they held their ground and completed their mission. Similar stories played out across dozens of small battles. Paratroopers who had landed miles from their objectives improvised new missions. Men who had lost their entire units joined with strangers and fought as if they had trained together for years. Officers and enlisted men alike made split-second decisions that shaped the course of the invasion.
At German 7th Army headquarters in Le Mans, over 100 miles from the fighting, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel struggled to make sense of the chaos. Reports poured in from every direction. American paratroopers at Sainte-Mère-Église, fighting near Lafayette and Carentan, landings at Utah and Omaha, British troops at Sword, Canadians at Juneau. The Allies were striking across the entire Norman coast. "Where are the reserves?" Rommel demanded, slamming his fist on the map table. "Why haven't we counterattacked?" His chief of staff hesitated. "Sir, Berlin has not authorized movement. The Führer's orders require his personal approval for deployment of the panzer divisions." "Then wake him," Rommel snapped. "Sir?" The officer checked his watch nervously. "It's 4 in the morning in Berlin. No one dares disturb him." Rommel's jaw tightened. "The invasion is happening now. We need armor now." But the tanks stayed idle. In Berlin, Hitler's staff refused to wake him, convinced the Normandy landings were a diversion and that the real invasion would come at Calais. 12 critical hours slipped away before authorization was finally granted. By then, the Allies had secured their beachheads and linked with airborne troops inland. When German reserves finally moved, they met disaster. Allied aircraft ruled the skies. P-47 Thunderbolts and Typhoons strafed every road, turning convoys into burning wreckage. Supply trucks exploded. Tank transporters were shredded before they reached the front. Battalions that should have arrived in hours took days, losing men and morale with every attack. Those who reached Normandy found not chaos, but disciplined resistance. American paratroopers, once scattered across fields and hedgerows, had regrouped into solid defensive networks. Each farmhouse, each crossroads, had become a fortress. On June 7th, Oberst Heinrich von Leutwitz led over 2,000 men to retake Sainte-Mère-Église. He expected a swift victory. The assault began at dawn with artillery pounding the town. But when his troops advanced, they were met with fierce, coordinated fire. The Americans had dug in among stone buildings, turning every window into a sniper's nest. Machine guns swept the streets, mortars struck assembly points, and tanks from the 4th Infantry Division now supported the defenders. Within an hour, von Leutwitz's attack ground to a halt. Casualties climbed, 50, 100, 200. By noon, he ordered a retreat. That night he wrote in his journal, "We were told the Americans were scattered and leaderless. What we found were soldiers who turned confusion into strength. They are everywhere. They fight as if the land itself belongs to them." The success of the airborne operation came at a terrible price. Of the 13,000 paratroopers who jumped into Normandy on the night of June 5th to 6th, over 2,500 were killed, wounded, or missing within the first 24 hours. Some drowned in flooded fields, weighed down with equipment. Others were killed in the air by anti-aircraft fire. Many died in scattered firefights across the countryside, often alone or in small groups. their stories never fully told. Private Robert Klein landed in a tree 3 miles from his drop zone. He hung there for 20 minutes, struggling to free himself, when a German patrol appeared below. They shot him as he hung helpless, his body left dangling in the harness as a warning to other Americans. Sergeant Michael Torres landed in a flooded marsh. His parachute filled with water, dragging him under. He cut himself free from his equipment and swam to shore, but lost his rifle, ammunition, and rations. For 2 days, he evaded German patrols, living on stream water and whatever he could scavenge. When he finally reached American lines, he weighed 30 pounds less than when he jumped. Lieutenant David Chen, his entire stick was killed or captured when they landed in the middle of a German bivouac area. Chen survived by playing dead among the bodies of his men, then escaping in the confusion of the morning naval bombardment. He fought his way back to American lines alone, completing his mission by destroying a German ammunition dump along the way. These stories of individual courage and sacrifice repeated thousands of times across Normandy. Men jumped into the unknown and fought with whatever they had, sometimes rifles and grenades, sometimes just knives and determination. But they accomplished their mission. By the evening of June 6th, the beachhead at Utah Beach was secure. The causeways were open. Reinforcements were pouring inland. And German forces, scattered and confused by the airborne assault, had missed their chance to throw the invasion back into the sea.
On June 8th, 2 days after the invasion, German intelligence finally compiled a comprehensive report on the American airborne operation. The numbers were staggering and, to German commanders, almost incomprehensible. 13,000 paratroopers had been dropped across an 80-square-mile area. They had seized and held 7 major crossroads, destroyed 12 communication centers, blocked 23 roads, and engaged German forces in over 200 separate firefights. Despite being scattered and often isolated, they had created such chaos in the German rear that coordinated counterattacks became impossible. More importantly, they had achieved their strategic objective. The troops landing at Utah Beach had suffered far fewer casualties than predicted because German reinforcements never reached the coast in time. The psychological impact was equally devastating. German soldiers reported feeling surrounded, uncertain, unable to move without encountering American forces. General der Artillerie Erich Marx, commander of LXV-4 Corps defending the invasion sector, admitted in a staff meeting, "We prepared for an airborne assault. We positioned forces to counter it. We trained for it. But when 13,000 men fell from the sky in darkness and storm, spread across our entire rear area, our preparations meant nothing. How do you defend against an enemy who is simultaneously nowhere and everywhere?" The answer, of course, was that you couldn't. The American airborne assault had turned conventional military thinking on its head. Traditional doctrine said paratroopers needed to land in concentrated groups near specific objectives. The Americans had been scattered by weather and darkness, landing miles from their targets. And that very dispersion had become their greatest advantage. Every small group of paratroopers became an independent fighting force, attacking targets of opportunity, adapting to circumstances, and creating uncertainty far beyond their actual combat power. A squad of 10 men at a crossroads could tie down a German battalion because the Germans had no way of knowing if that squad was the forward element of a larger force. Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the High Command, conducted a formal after-action analysis of the Normandy airborne operations. The classified report concluded, "The enemy has demonstrated a new form of warfare that our current defensive doctrine cannot counter. By accepting tactical disorder, they created strategic advantage. By sacrificing concentrated power, they gained ubiquitous presence. We must conclude that American military thinking has evolved beyond our understanding." That conclusion was particularly bitter for officers who had spent the previous years dismissing American soldiers as inexperienced and poorly led. the paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne had proven that American forces could be innovative, aggressive, and extraordinarily effective when given clear objectives and the freedom to achieve them through improvisation.
Within days, stories of the airborne assault spread through both armies. For the Americans, the paratroopers became instant heroes, men who had jumped into hell and fought their way out. Newspapers back home ran headlines about the Sky Soldiers and the Screaming Eagles. War correspondents scrambled to interview survivors and document their exploits. For the Germans, the story became a cautionary tale about underestimating the enemy. The same officers who had laughed at the idea of American paratroopers now spoke of them with grudging respect. Soldiers who had fought against them told stories of encountering Americans in unexpected places, of fighting men who refused to surrender even when surrounded and outnumbered. Lieutenant Hartwell, whose makeshift squad had held a crossroads for 6 hours, was recommended for the Distinguished Service Cross. When a reporter asked him how they had survived against such odds, he shrugged. "We did what we were trained to do. We adapted. We fought. And we trusted that the guys next to us, even if we just met them that night, would do the same." That trust, that ability to fight effectively with strangers, became one of the defining characteristics of the American airborne forces. The 82nd and 101st would go on to fight in Operation Market Garden, the Battle of the Bulge, and the final push into Germany. But it was Normandy, that chaotic night drop, and the desperate fighting that followed that forged their legend. Brigadier General Maxwell Taylor, commander of the 101st Airborne, wrote in his official report, "The success of our operation was not due to perfect planning or flawless execution. We succeeded because American soldiers at every level, from private to colonel, demonstrated initiative, courage, and adaptability under conditions of extreme chaos and danger. They proved that American fighting men are second to none." General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied Forces, visited the paratroopers on June 10th. He walked through field hospitals, shook hands with wounded men, and listened to their stories. Later, he wrote to General George Marshall, "The airborne operation in Normandy will be studied for generations. Not because it went according to plan, it didn't, but because it succeeded despite every conceivable obstacle. Our men jumped into a storm, landed scattered across enemy territory, and within hours had seized their objectives and opened the door for the invasion. I have never been prouder of American soldiers." When historians finally tallied the full cost and impact of the Normandy airborne operation, the numbers told a story of extraordinary sacrifice and achievement. Of the 13,000 American paratroopers who jumped on the night of June 5-6th, approximately 2,500 became casualties within the first 48 hours. Another 1,500 were scattered so far from their units that they didn't rejoin organized American forces for days or even weeks. Some fought as isolated guerrillas behind German lines until late June. But those losses purchased something invaluable: time and confusion. The Utah beach landing, supported by the paratroopers who had seized the causeways, suffered only 197 casualties out of 23,000 men landed, the lowest casualty rate of any D-Day beach. That success was directly attributable to the airborne forces who had disrupted German defenses and prevented reinforcements from reaching the coast. The strategic impact extended far beyond the first day. German forces in Normandy never recovered from the chaos created by the paratrooper drops. Throughout June and July, as the Allies built up their beachhead, German commanders struggled with a problem they couldn't solve: American forces operating behind their lines, attacking supply convoys, cutting communications, and creating a climate of uncertainty that paralyzed decision-making. Field Marshal Rommel, in his final report before being wounded in an air attack, wrote, "The American airborne assault demonstrated capabilities we did not believe they possessed. their willingness to accept high casualties in pursuit of strategic objectives, their soldiers' ability to operate independently when separated from command structure, and their overall tactical flexibility have proven superior to our forces in many respects. That admission, from one of Germany's most respected military commanders, represented a fundamental shift in how the Wehrmacht viewed American forces. The image of poorly trained, unmotivated soldiers had been shattered by 13,000 paratroopers who jumped into the night and changed the course of the war.
In the weeks following D-Day, the scattered paratroopers finally rejoined their units. They brought with them stories that would be told and retold for decades. Staff Sergeant William Patterson had landed 12 miles from his drop zone, alone and behind enemy lines. For 4 days, he evaded German patrols while moving toward American positions. Along the way, he destroyed 2 German supply trucks, cut 3 communication lines, and gathered intelligence on enemy positions. When he finally reached friendly forces, he delivered information that led to a successful attack on a German artillery position. Corporal James Fitzgerald landed in a tree and broke his leg when he hit the ground. Unable to walk, he hid in a barn for 3 days while German troops searched the area. A French farmer found him, splinted his leg, and helped him reach American lines. Fitzgerald later said the hardest part wasn't the pain or the fear. It was feeling useless while his fellow paratroopers were fighting. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Wolverton wasn't as fortunate. He was killed within hours of landing, leading his battalion in an attack on a German position near Saint-Côme-du-Mont. His last words to his men, spoken just before they jumped, became famous. "It is our destiny to meet the enemy here, and with God's help, we will win." He was 27 years old. These individual stories, multiplied thousands of times, created the tapestry of the Normandy airborne operation. Each paratrooper who jumped that night carried with them the hopes of the entire Allied cause. Each one who died bought seconds or minutes or hours that allowed the invasion to succeed. By June 12th, the Cotentin Peninsula was firmly in American hands. The 82nd and 101st Airborne were pulled off the front lines after 33 days of continuous combat. They had accomplished every major objective assigned to them, and several they had improvised on their own. The cost had been severe. Both divisions had lost over 40% of their strength in killed, wounded, or missing. Some companies had casualty rates exceeding 60%, but they had proven beyond any doubt that American paratroopers were among the finest combat soldiers in the world. When General George Patton, never one to give praise lightly, visited the 82nd Airborne before their return to England, he stood before the assembled men and said simply, "You jumped into hell and fought your way out. The Third Reich will remember what happened here. So will history." He was right. The German commanders who had laughed at American paratroopers before D-Day never made that mistake again. The legend of the 82nd and 101st Airborne, forged in the dark skies over Normandy, became a cornerstone of American military pride. The Normandy airborne operation established principles that would influence military thinking for generations. The idea that dispersed forces could achieve strategic objectives through coordinated chaos became a template for future operations. The emphasis on individual initiative and adaptability became central to American military training. But perhaps most importantly, the operation proved that courage and determination could overcome seemingly impossible odds. 13,000 men jumped into enemy territory in darkness and storm. They were scattered, often lost, frequently outnumbered, yet they completed their mission and opened the door for the largest amphibious invasion in history. Hauptmann Weber, who had laughed at the paratroopers before D-Day, survived the war. In a 1952 interview, he was asked about that night. His answer was simple. "We thought we knew everything about warfare. We had studied the tactics, prepared the defenses, positioned our forces perfectly, and then those Americans fell from the sky and showed us we knew nothing at all. They taught us that in war,
Audacity and courage can defeat careful planning. It was a lesson we learned too late. The paratroopers themselves rarely spoke of heroism. When asked about their actions, most deflected credit to their fellow soldiers. They had done their jobs, they had trusted their training, and when everything went wrong, when they landed miles from their objectives, in the middle of enemy territory, they had adapted and overcome. That ability to succeed despite chaos, to turn disaster into advantage, became the defining characteristic of American airborne forces. From Normandy to the Rhine, from the Bulge to the final assault on Germany, the paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne proved repeatedly that they were elite soldiers capable of achieving the impossible. But it all began on that stormy night in June 1944, when 13,000 men stepped out of airplanes into darkness and uncertainty. German commanders had laughed at them, believing paratroopers were propaganda and bluster. By dawn on June 6th, nobody was laughing anymore. The sky had been full of them, and the world would never be the same. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.